Hi everyone, hope that you all are doing well. Today we'll discuss how we can implement Redis with our Spring Boot application on Windows system. So before we jump into the video's context, I would like to request you that if you find my videos knowledgeable, please do hit like, share and comment on the videos. And if new to the channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon. So let's first go to a Git repository. I'll put the link into the description of this Git repository from where I have downloaded the Redis for my Windows system. So you can come to this Git repository and download this zip file for your right, and then extract that zip file. So this is my Redis zip file, and I've already extracted the zip file. From here we'll be running the Redis server. We'll get back to this later on, but let's now jump on to and discuss what is Redis and why are we using Redis. So Redis is an open source in-memory data structure store that can be used as a database, cache, streaming engine, message broker and more. So there are a lot of functionalities for which you can use Redis. So now the question is that why are we using Redis in today's application? So we are using it as a cache in our app. So as like we'll be implementing a example wherein we'll be fetching data from a database, right? So there would be a continuous calls on to fetch the data from the database. So to prevent the overhead and to prevent that we continuously hit the database, we'll implement Redis Cache. So when after the first time we have fetched the data and we have stored it into the Redis Cache, the next, second time, third time and the consecutive calls when we are making to fetch the data from that controller, the controller would be returning the results from the Redis Cache rather than hitting it to the database again and again. Hitting the query would be creating a lot of overhead. So that is why we are implementing Redis Cache in our app. Overview of what is Redis and why are we using Redis in our application. So now let's jump to IDE and let's create a small example. I'm on my IDE. Let me create a small Spring Starter project. So let's name this project as Spring Redis implementation. We are keeping the Java version as 21. My packages are com.code with raman.implementation. And let's go next. So the Spring version is 3.3.5. and we require few of the dependencies as we'll be creating a REST application. So I need a Spring Web dependency. I need to connect with the database in a JPA way, so I will require a JPA dependency, and I am connected to MySQL database, so I need the MySQL driver. Also, as I said that I am using Redis as a cache, so I have to add the Redis dependency as well. So I need to add Redis data dependency, right? So let me select this and let me finish the import, and let's wait that the project get imported. So my project is imported to the IDE, right? So this is the structure of my project. If I go to the pom.xml and let's see the dependencies that we have added. So we have the Java version as 21 and we have the dependencies of data JPA, data Redis. So this is the dependency for Redis implementation. Then we have starter web dependency, and then we have the MySQL connector dependency, right? So let me close this. And now let's go to the zip file that we extracted. Let me go to the folder where I extracted the zip file. So this is my folder where I extracted the zip file. What you have to do is you have to run the Redis server. So what you can do is you can go to CMD, the terminal that you are working on, and here what you have to do is you have to run the Redis server executable file. So let's say Redis, I am already in the package structure, so you can see that I already have a file redis server.exe. You have to select this and just do the enter. So you can see that the Redis server is now ready to accept connection on port 6375, right? So my Redis server has now started. So my cache building would be started whenever now I start my application, right? So now let's go to the IDE. We are done with the Redis server startup, right? So what we can do is let's go to the project, and first let's add some properties that we need to add to run the application. As we are working on the database as well, so we also need a database, and then we also need the configuration for Redis, right? So let me add the property. These are my properties in my application.properties. If you can see that I have the URL for the database connection, I have the username, password and the driver for MySQL. Then we have the DDL auto command for update, and then show SQL is true, And then there is two properties for Redis, that is Redis host, that would be up on the local host, and the Redis port, that is 6379. So if you go on to the CMD, you can see that the connection is running on 6379. So you have to specify the port on which your Redis server would be running, right? So we are done with the application.properties. Now what we have to do is, the first thing we have to do is that we have to tell that this application has cache enabled, right? So what you have to do is you have to add an annotation that is enable cache. So you have to add enable caching, right? So now for this application the caching is enabled, right? So first thing you have to do this, and now let's design some packages. Let's first write the configuration for Redis. So let me write a class, right, and also define a package here. I have to define a package of config, and my Redis config would be the file name, right, and I have to define the configuration in my Redis config. So here also you have to mark this as a bean, so you have to add @configuration as we do it for Spring Security configuration as well, and also you have to specify that you are enabling caching, right? So you have to specify that you are enabling caching, enable caching, right? So you have to specify enable caching. Now you have to create a method that will be returning a Redis template. So let's define a method that is public and it will be returning a Redis template. We have to define a Redis template, right? So you can see that the predefined class of Redis template is there. It is coming from Spring Framework data redis.core, right? And now you have to define the key value pair that you will be storing in. So let's define the key as string and the value as object. So let's say Redis template, will be returning a Redis template, and here we have to define a connection factory. So we have to have a Redis connection factory. So there is a Redis connection factory. Redis connection factory, can simply say connection factory. Now we have to add all the things that are being required by the template to build a template and to return a template, right? So now let me create a object of Redis template. Create an object of Redis template first. Redis template, we need string and an object. A Redis equals Redis template. Redis template, I have to say Redis template, right? To Redis template. Now you have to add few of the values in the Redis template. So we need to set the connection factory, right? So connection factory object we already have. Then you need to set the key serializer, right? So basically if I tell you, so we are setting the connection factory here. This is basically we are telling that how to connect to the Redis server, right? And we are passing the Redis connection factory to it. Then we'll set the key serializer. So this will tell the Redis how to convert the key to and from which format and retrieving into which format. So basically you have to tell that the key would be converted into which format and would be retrieved into which format. So that is why we are adding a key serializer. So here you have to mention string Redis serializer, right? And then you have to add the value serializer as well, right? So Redis template dot set value serializer, right? So in the value serializer, again we are telling that that serialize the value into a JSON format and then convert it into object when we are retrieving the object, right? So here you have to define generic Jackson. We need a class generic Jackson to JSON, right? Generic Jackson to JSON serializer, and then we'll return the rest template, right? So we will return the, sorry, not the rest template, Redis template, right? So in this way what we are doing is that for our Redis template we are telling, actually I have named this wrongly. I have to name this as Redis template, I've named it as REST template. So basically what we are doing here is that we are creating a template of key value pair, and we are telling that we are setting the Redis template with a connection factory that will tell the Redis that how to connect to the Redis server. Then we have the key serializer, that is that how we are converting the value of the key and how we are retrieving the value of the key. And same way we have the value serializer that tells that how we are converting the value into a format and how we are retrieving the value back into an object, right? So we are writing the REST template, right? So now we have the REST template. Now we have to write also I need to mark this as a bean, right? So basically we are saying that now Spring would be taking care of it, so we have marked this as a bean. And also we have to write a bean for cache manager, right? So also we have to write a bean for a cache manager. So let me write public cache manager, right? It will be returning a cache manager object, cache manager, right? And in this method we have to pass the Redis connection factory, Redis connection factory, right? So now we'll be creating a cache manager, right? This method is responsible for managing the caching behavior, right? So first what we'll do, we'll be setting the configuration into it. So let's default, let me say Redis cache configuration, and we'll say config equals Redis cache configuration dot default cache configuration, and then we are saying enter entry TTL, that is the total time allowed, right? Total time limit, right? So basically you have to set the total time for which the cache will be built, right? Let's say that I define a duration, and I say duration dot of millis or of minutes, and I'll define it as 10. So basically I'm saying that the cache will be enabled only for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes the cache will be nullified, and again the cache would be built up, right? So it will just be for 10 minutes, right? And let's say disable caching null values. So basically what we are saying that create a default cache config with the entry TTL of 10 minutes and disable caching null value. So basically we are saying if there is a null value that has come to store, right, that is to store into our cache, Redis cache, so Redis will be ignoring those null values, right? It won't be storing the null values. Now we have to return an object, so we'll say return on object of Redis cache manager dot builder, and in the builder part we'll pass the Redis connection factory, right, with the cache default, and we have passed the config, and we'll say build, right? So this is the object that will be returned as a cache manager object, right? So this is how you can define the Redis cache configuration, right? So now let's we have done with the cache configuration, right? So now let's go and let's define some other classes as well that we require. So let me define a class. Let's say I want to define a class, and I also want to define a package here. So let's say the package name is model and the class name is user, right? So I have to create a user class with serialization. Why serialization? Because as we said, while we are creating the Redis config, we are defining the serializers, right? We are saying string Redis serializers, right? So we are serializing the key value, right? So the key value would be coming up from this particular object only. So we need to have the object serialized, right? So let me say implements serializable, right? So when we implement serializable, we need to add some default serial version ID, right? So why this serial version ID is being added? So that at the time of deserialization, this serial version ID is being compared and checked that the request that is being made for deserialization is correct or not, right? It is coming from the correct source or not, right? So now let's say that I want to create an ID. So let's say I'll create an ID, long ID, and let me define this as @ID first, right? And also I need to pass the generation type, right? So strategy equals generation time dot type dot auto, right? And also mark this class as a entity, right? So we need the tables into the database, so we are marking this as @entity, right? And I will say that I need a string name, right? And also I will need a string email, right? So we need these fields to store into our database. Let me just define the getters and setters for these fields. So let me select all, or rather leave this, and define the getters and setters, right? So this is my entity, right? This is my entity structure. Looks like this. I have an ID, name and email, and ID is my primary key, right? So this is my user model. Now I also require a user repository, right? So as we will be interacting with the database, I also need a user repository. Let me define an interface, and let me define the package first. So I need a repository, and I'll say a user repository. I need a user repository, and the user repository will be extending the JPA repository, right? So we have done this many a times. You might be having the idea of. So we need my object that we have defined, a user object, and the primary key type. So I have defined a primary key type as long, right? So this is my repository. So let me mark this as a Spring Bean. So we'll say @repository, right? So my repository part is also done. Now let's define a service package, right? And let's define a user service. So let's say I want to create a class, and let's say user service, and I have to define the package also for it, that is service package, right? So here in this class, basically first let me mark this class as @service. Let me say @service. Now let's say that I want to first let me use this user service would be directly interacting with the repository to fetch data. So let me auto wire the user repository, right? So let me say user repository, right? And let's say that I have a method, like I have a method to fetch the data. So let's say I'll be returning a user object. So I'll say user and get by ID. Let's say that I get an ID and I have to fetch that data. So it would be of type long ID, right? So first let me import the user object as well, right? So now what I have to do is I have to use the user repository, and I'll say find by ID. So there is a method, predefined method in the CRUD repository. I'll use that and I'll pass the ID, right? So this I guess returns an optional, so I will have to do the get. Right? Or rather what we can do is we can keep this as an optional, right? We can keep this as an optional and we don't do the get part, right? We just simply return the data. But before we fetch the data, I'll have to write to specify or signify that the query to the database is going or not. Let me write a system.out.println statement, right? So I have to write a println statement, and let's say let's write a statement here, fetching data from database, right? And let's say we have written this. Now why I am writing this system print statement, because for the first time when we are fetching the data from the database, the data would be fetched from the database, right? So this line would be printed and a query would be printed to fetch the data. But the next time I am trying to fetch with that same ID, this line and the query would not get printed, right? It would be fetched from the cache itself. So how to define that the value should be fetched from the cache after the first time the value is being stored into the cache, right? So for that you have to add a annotation, that is cache. You have to say cacheable, and in the cacheable you have to define the key, right? So the key would be a ID, right? First you have to define the value that would be returned, right? So the value would be user, right? Value would be user, right? And you have to define the key, right? So the key would be a ID, right? The ID that has been getting supplied. So this is the way where you define that for this method the caching is being enabled, and for the first time when the database when the data request is being sent to fetch the data, the query would be going to the data, and then thereafter the data that has been fetched would be stored into the cache itself, right? So the next time the request comes for this particular ID, the code directly will be checking into the cache, and if the code finds the value into the cache with that particular ID, it will not go to the database, it will directly fetch the data from the cache and return to the database, return to the user, right? So this is how you implement cache for your calls, right? Now also I require a method to save the data, right? So I don't need anything as an output, so I'll say, or rather let's return the user, and let's say save user, right? And in this you will get a user, right? So you'll get a user object, and what you have to do is you have to simply say return user repository dot save, and in the save method you have to pass the user entity, right? But now as I said that we have defined enable cache on our main class, right? So my complete project would have a cache enabled, right? Same way goes for the save method as well, that if we are defining or if we are not defining, the cache is enabled for this method as well. So how to prevent that, right? For the saving of the data we don't need cache. So what we can do is we can simply say cache, we can say cache evict, right? Cache evict, and in the cache evict you have to pass the same values and the key, right? So we are saying that there shouldn't be, the cache evict is for the user and the key as an ID, right? Same way you have to define it for the save method as well. So now cache evict tells that you don't need cache for this method. You don't have to store data into the cache when at the time of save call, right? So this is my service class, right? So this is my small service class. Now let's go and let's define a REST controller, and then we'll run the application. So let me say new class, and I'll say user controller, and also I need to define the package. So my package is this, and what we have to do is we need to define this as a REST controller, as I'll be hitting the calls from postman. I'll say REST controller, and I'll say request mapping, and let me map this request by saying /API/users, right? And let's say we'll be interacting with the service, so let me auto wire the user service, So I'll say auto wired, and let me say user service, user service, user service, right? And let me define a public method that would be returning the output to the user, that would be of type user, right? I'll be get user by ID, and a long ID would be supplied. First let me define this as a get mapping. I'll say get mapping, and in the get mapping I have to tell that what mapping it is, so I'll say ID, right? So in my method I have to tell that how this ID is being supplied to the controller, so I'll say path variable as it is coming into my URL itself, so I'll say path variable long ID, right? So this is my method, and I'll say return, let me import this user, return user service dot get by ID, and I'll pass the ID, right? So this will be returning an, so I have to say or else return a null, right? So this is a method to handle the optional, right? So now let me define a post mapping as well. So the post mapping would be like public user save. Here we'll be getting a request body, right? I'll say request body. So we have the request body, and we'll say user, right? And here what we have to do is I have to simply say user service dot save, right? So my controller level is also ready, right? So my properties are also done, my controller is ready, my Redis configuration is ready, my model is ready, my repository is ready, and my service is also ready, right? And also my Redis server is already running, right? So now let me go to the properties, and let me copy the schema name, and let me go to the database, and let me create a schema. So let me say create schema. Let me run this query, right? And let me say that this, so we have this schema, so let me set this as default, right? So now let's go and let's run the application. So let me go to the main class of my application, and let me simply right click and say run as Spring Boot application. So my application is started, right? So now let's go to the database, and let's see that our tables are available or not. So my user table is now available. So now let's go to the postman, and let me try and post some data to the database. So let me say post, and let me say body, and in the body I have to select raw, and I will be sending the input in a JSON format. So let's say localhost 8080, and what was my post call? Let me go to the controller part, and let me see. So it was API/users, right? So let me go and let me say API/users, and in my JSON format let me input name of the user. Let's say the name is Raman, and the email, right? So let's say the email is Raman1 or raman@gmail.com, right? So now let me hit the server to save some data into a database. So it says internal server error. Why it has set the internal server error? So here you can see that I have got a internal server error because it is saying that the key is null, because I have done I have actually marked this in a wrong way. So I have to first say we are saving the users, and let's say users, and in the key part of the saving we don't have the ID as an input, so we have an object as an input, so we have to say user dot ID, right? So the user that is coming to save into the database, we have to get that ID, right? So we have to pass user dot ID. I have passed simply ID. We are not getting an ID as an input, we are getting an user object as an input. So let me save and let me rerun the call. I guess the data would be saved into the database. Let me check. It's the error has come for the Redis cache. Yes, so you can see that the data is being saved into the database. So let me rerun the application. So we already have the data into our database, just that the exception came for the Redis. So my application has started again. So let me now save some other data. Let me say I would save Raman1 and Raman1 @gmail.com. So you can see that the output has come, right? So now let me hit a get call, right? So let me say I will be hitting a get call. So let me copy this and let me go to the get window, and I will pass the ID here, right? So ID is 1, right? So so now you can see that our console looks like this, right? So now let me hit the get call, right? So let me hit the get call. So the data is being returned. The ID is 1, name is Raman, email is raman@gmail.com. Now if I take you to the console part, you can see that this statement fetching data from database and a query to fetch the data is being printed on the logs, right? So let me fetch the data again. Let me fetch the data 2-3 times, right? Second time and the third time, but you will go to the console, you will see that this is printed only for one time, right? So the second time and the third time the data is coming from the Redis cache rather than from the database. Now if I try to fetch the data of user2, right? So now again this statement would get printed, right? So if I go to the console, you can see that the statement is printed again, fetching data from the database, and the query has been there, right? So now if I fetch the user2 again, so you will see that there is no such statement printed. So the data is coming from the Redis itself, right? So this was it from this video, right? So today we have implemented Redis cache with a Spring Boot application, right? So hope that you people like, share and comment on the videos, and if new to the channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon. Hope to see you in the next video. Till then, happy learning.